Okay, hello, welcome everybody. This is a recorded session for the 20th anniversary of the Miami University Center for Community Engagement in Over the Rhine. I'm very pleased today to welcome three guests, in particular to talk about the sort of history of not only the center itself, but also in particular the work of the founder of the center, Tom Dutton. Who's had an influence on all of us. My name is Jeff Kruth. I'm an assistant professor at Miami University in the Department of Architecture and Interior Design. And with that, I'll allow our guests to introduce themselves. Maybe start with Kenton.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff. I'm Kenton Card. I'm a PhD student in urban planning at UCLA, and I'm a guest researcher in Berlin. And yeah, I'm comparing for my dissertation housing movements in Berlin and Los Angeles, and super excited for the conversation. I have so much respect for the center and the work, and it's been super inspiring for over 10 years. So thanks for inviting me to join. Mathias, you want to go next?
Yeah, of course. Hi, I'm Mathias Heyden. I'm in Berlin, actually, but also traveling back and forth between here and the States since quite a while, quite frequently. I'm an architect, urban designer, activist, and right now, as you also can read, I'm working. Oh, this is wrong, the wrong banner. So I'm not an assistant professor anymore. I'm an administrator at Cityhall Friedrichshain-Kreuzerg in Berlin. Which is a half-time position, trying to be an intermediate actor amongst, trying to bring together more strongly city district administrators, local politicians, and activists. And on the side, I'm doing still my research and activist work, and part of it is to engage in the project we were talking about today. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Michael.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me into this conversation. So currently I'm Vice Provost and founder of the Office of Public Scholarship and Engagement, which is a university-wide office at UC Davis. I'm also a professor of urban design in the landscape architecture and environmental design program here. Prior to coming to UC Davis, I was a professor of architecture, landscape architecture at Penn State, where I also served as the director of the Hamer Center for Community Design from 1999 to 2007. And then lastly, I served as president of the Association for Community Design from 2003 to 2005.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all. Welcome. So maybe I'll start in this way, because you all have been actually working together for some time, and one of the things that's kind of drawn you together is the work of Tom Dutton, our founder of the center. And for those who do not know, Tom Dutton, longtime professor here at Miami University, and passed away tragically a few years ago. But he had been working since the 1980s in inner city Cincinnati, in the neighborhood of Over the Rhine. And in the mid-90s, started to take students down there for some design build work, and eventually established the center as we know it today in 2002. So that's the 20th anniversary. And I think through this conversation, we'll tease out not only sort of Tom's work, but actually how it's kind of influenced all of us, I think, in many ways. So maybe I'll sort of open up with this question of, one, maybe how did you all come to know each other and get to know each other's work? And also Tom and sort of your relationship with him, either through his work or personally. And maybe we can just sort of start there as a way to kick it off.
I'm kind of curious. I want to know chronologically who knew him first. I guess that's one interesting thing. But anyway, I'm talking. I was an undergraduate doing research on public interest design and design build programs around the country in 2008, and became quite frustrated and disillusioned by the kind of work of kind of charity architecture that it is often, or humanitarian architecture, and the kind of community engagement that often isn't there in those kinds of projects where they are kind of like fly in, create a project and fly out. And so I had kind of began a correspondence with Tom in 2010 when I was kind of finishing that project. And then that in became a kind of answer to me, fusing radical critique, community engagement, and design build with a kind of social movement. And then there's a kind of serendipitous history we have where then I was in Berlin and got to know Mathias. So I'm gonna pass over to Mathias then to maybe make that linkage.
So for me, it was that I was part of the squatter movement in East Berlin in the early 90s while I was studying architecture, and became quite unhappy with how the discipline was taught to me. As you might imagine, as I was kind of being able with 20 other adults kind of to squat a place, to kind of secure a place, to be affordable housing for the long run, but also to offer non-commercial kind of workspaces, event spaces, and so on. That combination of studying architecture and having that kind of socially just, emancipatory kind of radical practice on the ground, so to say, brought me to question, so how did others, before my time, so to say, like the previous generation, do that work? To make it not too long, I started to research the history of participatory design in Europe. And out of that, as a follow-up, I started a research project with a kind of radical architectural magazine called Architektur, which then led to looking after the history of community design in the States. It became an exhibition, it became a series of public talks. And that was the time where Michael just had been the president of the Association of Community Design. So Michael became part of that project, that exhibition and public talk project. And then I continued with my partner, who's an artist and photographer, revisiting sites of radical community design work since the 60s up to the early 2000s. And through that project, the follow-up project, so to say, looking at particular places and actors, we got pointed out by Roberta Feldman in Chicago that we definitely should meet Tom, that Tom is one of the most radical, not only thinkers, but also practitioners in the realm of community design. And so I was happy, or we were happy to exhibit that research, which I had done with my partner, artist and photographer Ines Schaber, in 2015 in Ann Arbor at Michigan State at the Taubman College. And Tom came over. It was fucking freezing cold in the midst of the winter, but he and his wife came over on the way back from Chicago to Cincinnati. And that was unfortunately the first and only time I met him. But it was such a wonderful experience to have him there for 2 or 3 days participating in the workshops with faculty and students. So that's my story, how I came to the table, so to say.
Great.
Yeah, and so so I got introduced to Tom really through his writings initially, as an architecture student in this sort of early to mid 90s, and then after graduate school, stumbling into academia, running the Community Design Center, being a junior scholar is really where I engaged his works pretty significantly. And so it was partly a breath of fresh air, given his critiques of studio pedagogy, and I was frustrated with curricula as a student, where I was organizing students, teams, doing work in communities throughout the Bay Area. So his work was pretty inspirational as a reference point for me. And then also in my own scholarship, writing about the sort of connection between social justice and urban design, participatory design, sort of structural analyses, the context in which we find ourselves doing work. But I met him was in 2008 in person at an Imagining America conference. I was part of a panel of of colleagues that were part of a book project called Erasing Boundaries, looking at service learning in architecture and planning. And so he was in the audience and he was asking questions. And a number of us who had not met him on the panel knew who he was. And we were just honored to be in his presence. And he showed such a level of care and support of the work of us. So that was pretty memorable for me in terms of my first meeting with Tom, and then subsequently in correspondence through his encouragement of the type of writing I was doing at the time.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, thank you all for those great responses. It strikes me as kind of interesting that sort of shared maybe between the three of you, and certainly probably for myself as well, who also knew Tom. I was a student of Tom's for many years, and got me from urban planning into architecture, and that was an interesting shift. But it began seemingly with this kind of frustration, maybe with studio pedagogy, with sort of the discipline itself, and these kinds of things. I'm curious if you all could maybe lay out for us how some of that frustration and sort of Tom's work has influenced maybe your own studio pedagogy, or the ways in which you engage teaching and or these kind of institutional relationships. Yeah, whoever maybe wants to take that.
Maybe we'll just keep the same order going. Yeah, I mean, I think for me as an undergrad, I mean, I just like rejotted the list. I had done field work on the Rural Studio, the Gulf Coast Community Design Center, Studio 804, the Steve Badanes' shop in Seattle, Architecture for Humanity, Detroit Collaborative Design Center, and I had interviewed folks from other places, and I was really trying to understand how and why architects were coming in without kind of grappling with these contradictions of how poverty is produced and reproduced, and racism and structural dynamics, such as, getting pushed out from communities. And so anyway, I began kind of reaching out to Tom in 2010, and actually my writings, some publications from 2011, Tom had given me feedback on. And as I then, he actually invited me to come to visit Ohio, and I stayed on campus, and he gave me a tour, and we had a nice interview in 2014. I was able to see the center and, tour over the Rhine with him a bit. But I think throughout this process, Tom helped me see that you can link these kinds of pedagogical practices of the studio in architecture or in planning with movements. And there are broader traditions, such as insurgent planning, and you can reconceptualize the profession, and you can challenge what does a scholar activist mean? What does it mean to be an activist that then yields these kind of professionalizing tools? So I know that anyway, that kind of dialogue with the writing and learning from the practice. And I think it's funny because I remember in 2011, me writing my critique of public interest design and Tom giving me feedback on it, and Tom being like, yeah, I think you're getting there, but you don't quite understand what we're doing yet, And he was super generous to talk with me and work with me, but it was we do have this radical critique, but it's really about this deep relationship and really listening and having the vision and the campaign of the movement in Over the Rhine guide what the professionals do. And that, I think that's taken years to challenge how that can work. So anyway, I think now as a planner, and as somebody writing a PhD on social movements and interested in scholar activism, it's, for years, the model of engaging a center, working in a center has been a kind of career goal for me, where it's how can I be involved in a center that works with communities, that does critique as well? Critique of structural racism, let's remember, Tom wrote about police murder in 2001. He changed the narrative around it's not a riot, it's rebellion, and dialogue with key thinkers, like Robin D.G. Kelley and Henry Giroux. So anyway, among many others. So that's definitely was a major impact in how I thought about planning and insurgent planning. So.
Michael, do you want to continue, or shall I? Because maybe another perspective from the States.
Sure. So I think two ways. I think I would say that the sort of social practice of design and this idea of emplacement like with others, right? Part of a struggle in a location and through really directed action. So I think echoing some of what Kenny just said, coming out of architecture and planning school and jumping into kind of a different alternative type of practice that was really challenging the profession, challenging the education. In many ways, in school, the education actually was in the street and organizing. It wasn't in the studio. That was where my learning took place. And so learning the sort of boundaries between, professional, client, and even problematizing that relationship of a client, and designing the community as designer, and being more of a facilitator in that process. So, I think it's important to mention that sort of the influences for me really that, in graduate school, this was in the early 90s, and many of us were reading the English translation of The Production of Space. And it was during that decade that the work of, Marxist geographers such as David Harvey or others that I studied with, like Manuel Castells, and looking at cities from a very different lens, from a structural lens. But then what do you do with that, right? And so I think Tom as inspiration, he took serious these critiques, but he interpreted them from the perspective of praxis, right? Sort of engaging in theory and practice and learning and reflection all together. And so practice is a form of social critique in action to me as one of the sort of things that comes to mind. And I think the second sort of influence in sort of my trajectory was Tom's introduction of critical pedagogy into architecture, right? Inspired by the writings of Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Press. And then, Tom being an interlocutor with Henry Giroux and that sort of movement, thinking about education as freedom, thinking about there's always an authoritarian tendency there that we have to resist. But then also to think about the relationship between knowledge and power and the ability to ask yourself, what do I do with that? And to take action. So, some of his works, I think, Voices in Architectural Education, right? Looking at pedagogy, I think there's 1991. And then he was a special issue co-editor for a number of, series of issues in the Journal of Architecture Education. Right. Along the same lines, looking at cultural politics and education in the early 90s, post-modernizing pedagogy, that he did a special issue co-edited with Lee and Hurst Mann in 91 as well. And then branching out from pedagogy and housing being a really key focus of Tom's work, the work he did with Tony Schumann in the early 90s as well. So I think it's important to recognize, and maybe it doesn't register at such a local level in terms of some of the center work, but maybe it does. But for those of us, what he did to, in a sense, create a space of discourse within architectural pedagogy and practice in scholarship and problematizing our own identities, I think has really been a lasting influence, this idea of the hidden curriculum, right? So, and that, community service is complicit in reproducing systems of oppression. So what do we do with that? So he raised more questions for many of us as we sort of began in our early careers and challenged both the way we were being taught and the ways that we actually ultimately wanted to practice.
I would add on that as I mentioned, in terms of when I was being educated to become an architect, this was the early 90s, and as of course all of you know, this was when the Berlin Wall had come down, and there was a West Berlin on the one hand, which was part of the capitalist system, but there was also East Berlin, which used to be the former capital, the capital of the former GDR, the socialist part of Germany, right? And nobody at the School of Architecture was raising the political and economic questions. So the economics in space, also in terms of the right to the city, were not debated at the School of Architecture. And that kind of continued onwards then into the early 2000s, when real estate development at that time didn't really take place as it was imagined, by the ones who had the power, the political power and the money. So there was still a lot of vacant spaces, not like in Detroit, but quite an amount of vacant spaces. And young emerging architects with whom I had studied, they understood that this is, of course, a chance to make the city our own, but they only professionalized in terms of urban pioneering. So kind of getting their hands on spaces for, a limited amount of time. And they were really close friends and colleagues of mine, don't get me wrong, and they did really great work. But there was almost no discourse in terms of the economics of space. There was almost no architect nor planner from that alternative leftist scene who was trying to understand the economics of space. And that was happening kind of parallel to, of course, all the other kind of neoliberal trends, also kind of then incorporating the means of participation into public dialogue. So all of a sudden, so to say, or over years, but then all of a sudden participation was kind of cool, right? You would, of course, organize participatory processes. You would, of course, say yes to participatory design, but it never became radical in the sense that it was really discussing the roots of the problem, right? What are really the basic causes of this or those problems? And now coming back to Tom and the center's work, also then through my aforementioned research in terms of community design in the States, I think we can see a similar history, right? That not all of them, but quite a big number of early community design architects, planners were quite radical in the late 60s, early 70s. And then with Reagan and all the other kind of neoliberal trends, as public funding kind of was not there anymore, that was one reason. But on the other hand, kind of being then forced to even more to question yourself as a community design center, how to keep on going as an institution, things became watered down, right? So there was a mainstreaming and watering down history. There is a mainstream and watering down history I think we can look on. And that's quite comparable, in terms of if you look at such participatory design in the States and in the US. And so I think it's astounding that Tom kind of kept on fighting, so to say, right? In the early 90s, early 2000s, when almost nobody was kind of raising the real questions, right? And he did it theoretically, intellectually, but also I would say spiritually, right? In terms of the understanding what human life is about in the very end. And that I don't know if there's a text where he's really arguing for that, but in my words, or what I'm really still missing still till today is that there's still today not enough talk about what values we basically have, individually and collectively. So basically, and in my case, one major kind of discourse I kind of stepped in since a couple of years is to understand the city as an urban commons, right? The means of spatial commons. And I think that relates very well to also Tom's and the center's approach in Over the Rhine. That our work really should be value-based. And that's, again, of course, that's a conversation about our spiritual, philosophical, conceptual values, but again, it's also then we need to talk numbers. We need to talk economics. And that means we also need to understand economics. And that means, in terms of coming back to your question, Jeff, I think that's something which is still lacking, at least in Berlin, in our schools of architecture and planning, that there also needs to be alternative real estate economics need to be taught, right? And they're not part of the curriculum yet. And that's a pain in the ass, to say it quite frankly, right? So I leave it here.
Yeah,
I just want to say, like, I think, Mathias, like, you nailed such an important point, like integrating the political economy. And I think that's what Tom was able to do. And it's a question for how can curriculums change? How can these institutions change to have this broader spectrum of kind of work? I mean, you know, students in this program, I mean, I was rereading the School of Life article that Tom has, and it's like, you know, you're living in the neighborhood, you're having potlucks with community members, you're both doing an internship, you're taking other classes to get a more comprehensive critical perspective of this, and you're journaling and you're reflecting on your journals so this is not education in the metaphor that we know in the West, that these are like empty vessels that we just pump them with information and they shoot out the other end. This is a comprehensive, like, holistic process. And I think it's a serious challenge to just how to change other curricula like this across the country. So,
and if I could just chime in too, I think Tom, through his writing and the work of the center and engagement in Over the Rhine, it in many ways is very anticipatory, right? Because we're having conversations in the university now around settler colonialism, reparations, right? Those are types of topics that he was engaging in, and ultimately that there's a reckoning that needs to take place. And he was calling out institutions decades ago, and we are only starting to even understand what we need to do and to change so that we actually remain relevant. And part of that relevancy is really sort of interrogating those boundaries of where knowledge is produced, right? And really understanding that knowledge and expertise resides in many different locations, and to privilege higher education as a space is a fallacy. It's just not going to work if we're going to really be able to address many of the types of issues around racism, poverty, other aspects around looking at climate. I mean, these are all intersectional injustices that have to be addressed. And what is the role of higher education? And it's not going to be done with the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a few threads, I think, through all the comments of just, one kind of recognizing, right, there was quite a bit of kind of this radical critique in the 60s and 70s, as Mathias kind of pointed out. And Tom sort of consistently, was on board with that as public interest design was changing and was becoming more funder friendly and institutionalized and these kinds of things. And so that to me has always kind of been, something of an outlier in some sense, as that kind of happened, particularly in the mid 90s, 2000s, that there was still this kind of radical current in the work of Tom and the center. And I think as you all are sort of saying, right, some of that is, not only ahead of its time, but also just, these are still persistent issues, right? And I think there's been kind of within the last probably 2 or 3 years in particular, architects, planners, et cetera, trying to sort of reconcile with some of these issues that have frankly kind of been overlooked within the broader discourse for quite some time. So I think that's kind of this interesting lens of thinking about, sort of where have we been, how has, how has some of this critique kind of persisted, but then also where things are going. And so maybe to that point, I can kind of ask the question of, you all have slightly kind of different backgrounds. Michael, you're sort of at that kind of administrative level. Kenny, you're sort of studying, writing, doing all these kinds of things. Mathias, you're kind of working more at this kind of municipal level. And so I'm curious, what do you kind of see? Maybe through the lens of Tom, but also through your own kind of work and interpretations of these things. Maybe where do you see some of these trends kind of going, or how do you kind of incorporate these things into your own work, either through the past several years or as you see things kind of moving into the future?
I mean, I can start.
Sure.
I mean, right now, or maybe I didn't mention before, just as an add-on. So after having been a squatter, activist, architect for a couple of years, and then trying to make my money as a freelancing man guy, I was teaching for quite a while at the chair of urban design at the TU, and we were kind of testing community design approaches quite radically as I was on board. But of course it was limited, right? Like limited in that sense that students are there only a semester, then they go to another class and so on and so on. But still, I think that universities, as they should ideally exist for another couple of decades, so to say. Or in other words, I'm a true believer in public education, right? So, and as long as our overall system of states and economy is not collapsing totally, there will be public institutions such as universities, right? So universities needs to be understood as a crucial contributor, I think, for critical or for radical change. So I'm just talking in terms of also economics or resources, who can do the work, right? But of course that needs to be thought through and tested quite carefully. And UN Over the Rhine and other community design centers at other universities in the States have a much broader experience. We don't have community design centers at German universities within schools of planning and architecture. We only have individual professors and their assistant professors, and they once in a while do such kind of work. So getting back to your future, so one of my ambitions in Berlin is to at least support that chair where I was working at formerly, that they engage in how far they could do community-based design center work in the future. So that's one trajectory I'm working on. And I'm trying to support it from within Cityhall, Friedrichshain-Kreuzerg, where I'm an administrator, which is also super interesting because, that's the second kind of institution, I would say, which will be there forever. that's local politics, or, there will be politicians and administrators hopefully doing more for the public good in the future than they do actually. But anyway, that's another form of institution which we can kind of count on. And so how can these institutions, how can City Hall in such a local City Hall in such a big city like Berlin contribute to radical change? And we are quite lucky in that very district because we have a deputy mayor for planning and building affairs who came to the job with an activist background. He's very open to the municipalist movements in Barcelona or in other European cities. So we have a project, an overall project going on in our City Hall, really trying to bring together much more strongly, let's say, civil society expertise and institutional expertise of city district administration. And there are a couple of projects, I don't want to name them all, but the overall goal is to not to overcome, but on the one hand, to strengthen citizen participation, but at the same time, to push forward cooperation. We call it common good cooperation. And and the background is pretty simple, because in terms of public space, it's kind of quite easy to give the people a stronger say, because Cityhall is basically owning the land, right? Public space is public property in Berlin. So if there is citizen participation, you always can promise citizens that their ideas can be implemented depending on the resources to make this or those changes. But if it comes to housing, for example, it becomes much more difficult. Even so, we have a lot of public housing in Berlin, like about a quarter of the housing stock, a little less, something between 30 to 40% of the Berlin housing stock is public property. But these are public housing companies, but legally, in terms of their legal form, they are private companies. So they are forced to make profit. It's limited, but they're still asked to make profit by the leading city officials. So even then, when we as a local administration want to have citizen participation in new public housing development, we cannot do that only by the means of community design, great participation supported by these or those university actors. We really need to establish modes of cooperation, of working together, legally and economically, so to say. And that's super interesting. It's super challenging. And getting back to the main topic of our meeting here, for that work, of course, the work of Tom and the center is crucial, right? It's not crucial, and I cannot include it in my everyday work. That's quite difficult because there's everyday struggles which don't allow discourse. But it's crucial for me, and it's crucial for other colleagues once in a while to reach back to such practices like in Over the Rhine, and to such texts as Tom wrote, right? Basically to remember oneself what things are about in principle. That would be my take on it.
Kenny, should I respond to that question, given there's a little focus on the higher education?
Sure.
I feel like I'm the straw man in this conversation here, being a faculty administrator. So in terms of my current work and the type of influences, I think that that still remain. I think, you know, Tom's view of power structures kind of reminds us of our own situatedness within institutions of higher education. And, you know, sometimes we kind of forget about that, but we have, I think, a need to reflect about that critically. So I think, informing one's understanding of these sort of tensions about one's location within an institution, not necessarily as a problem, but more as a sort of location of critique and to, you know, again, self-examination, but also for those of us in institutions that have a level of power, to use that power and that position really to think about the university as a resource and, you know, mining those resources, stealing those resources. My chancellor and provost may not want me to be hear this, but, you know, this idea that of the undercommons, right? That we are in, but not of the university. We are using it for different means. And so in terms of the way I look at my work now as administrator is really facilitating that extraction, facilitating curating spaces to challenge the ways the universities operate. So in more practical terms, you know, this idea of community engagement and participation, which is central to the work of Tom and the centers, is how do we take that and integrate it into research and inquiry to the teaching practices. So my mission is really to change the culture of the university, and it's really bringing in this ethos of community engagement that Tom wrote so much about around mutuality, reciprocity. I mean, these are things that we're talking about now, but Tom talked about those years ago, right? But I think there's an issue around social justice or justice around the integration of community engagement in the academy. And it really looks at knowledge and this idea of epistemic justice, right? Mm-hmm. Interrogating the ways in which knowledge is produced and how it's policed by academics, and to really open up those boundaries and assert different ways of being, different ways of knowing, and different ways of doing. That does involve, community collaborators, co-conspirators. So it's also like unlearning and de-disciplining ourselves, and it's really about, thinking about Freire's influence on Tom and Rios. It's about learning, right? It's not about teaching and how we learn with, but it's also about critical inquiry in terms of, and not just research to publish a journal article or a book. Why are we really here? So for my office in the Office of Public Scholarship and Engagement, which in a sense is a center, if you will, but magnified to or scaled up to the whole university. So it's not just design and planning, but it's, for me, working with all our 10 colleges and schools, working with, environmental scientists, social scientists, humanists, designers, right? And so how do we take the ethos of community design, right, and the approaches and apply it to higher education writ large? So, we're working on faculty recognition and reward programs, especially around tenure and promotion. Community engaged work needs to be recognized as not only legitimized at the university, but as a really important contribution to the future of knowledge production, the future of public universities. We organize faculty fellows programs where we bring cohorts of faculty together, create a community of belonging, and it's amazing the stories I hear from faculty saying, wow, I've been at the university for 25 years and I finally find my tribe, right? So those are important as well. We're building, we're organizing, we're using those spaces as forms of organizing in the institution. So after participating in these programs, these faculty are in different locations of leadership. And then lastly, just another example is, we have a research grant program that we provide to researchers and faculty every year. And the one requirement is that they have a community partner. And we're not talking about a letter of support. They have to demonstrate that they have a partner that they want to engage and build a relationship over time. And we provide resources for that relationship building. And it's critically key to do that. But it also then translates often that those projects expand and more resources are sort of accessed after, working in those initial stages. A colleague of mine said, oh, Michael, don't call it seed funding, call it soil funding. We have to prepare the soil before we actually sow the seeds.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Super interesting, guys. Yeah, I think my I don't really remember the question, but I think one of the points that kind of inspires me about the work, the center, and my own professional trajectory. I mean, I've said for a long time, I feel like I have an axe to grind against architecture and the establishment of architecture, and the kind of, the phrase was used earlier, making the projects more funder friendly in a lot of cases over the years, rather than really asking the hard questions. Why is there such racial? Why, when I was in Hale County, Alabama, were people explaining to me how the job at the, of cutting off fish heads was more demeaning than taking the welfare check, and these complicated dynamics that are totally erased by, not erased, but overlooked by a kind of, material-based project. I mean, not to overly But anyway, I'm going to share a quote. I mean, what one architect told me when the first Rural Studio project was released, that he basically, said to MUCCE there, looking at the building, wow, how long do you think this is going to stand? How good does the project look? And MUCCE said to him, supposedly, what he told me is, it just needs to stand long enough for the Kodak moment. So if you think about this kind of material project that we can take a photo of, we can have one of the most, high quality photographers in the country to create object photography of. And then you think about Tom, where it's like the first projects were students were raising the money and building the project. And they were building the project for a modest renovation for a community partner. Totally different. They're in the same profession, but the profession continues to look at certain benchmarks for what it means to do kind of social work in this field. And I think, there's a quote from Tom from a news interview that he gave where he says, the pedagogy of the hammer only goes so far. And I find this so interesting, where it's like, yes, we can work with materials, we can take the design, we can work with the craft, and then what does that mean? Where do we go work after that? So I think for me, taking this critique of architecture, using and elevating Tom, and I've been telling some folks I wrote a Wikipedia page article for Tom because there hasn't been one, and we need this to be, added to and grow. And this is a place where people can, document different contributions he's made as a collective encyclopedia place. But I think in my then trajectory into planning and thinking about housing policy, coming at this at the project of how do we interpret post-recession housing crisis in Los Angeles and in Berlin. And when I was in architecture education as a master's student in Berlin, as I was thinking about my thesis project, the instructor said to me, gentrification isn't happening in Berlin. This isn't a problem. So you have this kind of depoliticized, kind of language going on in many different vectors, different places, even a place very politicized like Berlin. So I think something that's always inspiring about this work is the public engagement, the engagement in writing op-eds, the agitprop work, the kind of experimental dynamic of how to do more, do the design build work, do the immersive work, and do more, and be willing to get into public intellectual dialogues. So, I have tried to write more for more popular avenues as well as academic articles, writing for Jacobin, writing for the Planners Network's Progressive City outlet, and film has been a kind of constant avenue. So I've been able to make, these are kind of, I call them public scholarship films, where they're elevating the work of scholar activists. One on racial capitalism by the work of abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and another one that we're working on called Why Abolition Now, reflecting with 3 police abolitionists in 2020 about this moment of action, and specifically from campus police abolition. So I think that's a kind of another vector of action. And I think in terms of the research project and how the kind of influence of this corpus of work in rethinking planning, I think returning to Tom's writings, it's fascinating that when you're doing work where you're trying to get interviews or you're trying to be an activist. I mean, I work in Berlin and I'm not German, and my German's not great. And you might get pushback from someone. Oh, like, why are you, are you just flying in for this interview or not? And how you build those relationships. And, I'm returning to conversations with Tom, and he had this line where it's like, oh, if I'm getting pushed back, and constantly people are going to be like, hey, what are you doing here? Are you really about our vision or your vision? And Tom played this role for the university that I think we need to remember, right? He would call out, gentrification as a white gentrification process. He would kind of call out the white liberals coming from Miami down to over the Rhine and kind of mediate that process. But he talked about also when you're trying to get closer to communities, you know, and you get that pushback, it's like, okay, humble, sit in the back, do the dishes, wash the potatoes, show that you're going to show up, be patient. And let's remember, he walked in over the Rhine in 1981 and started doing work there 15 years later. And so there's this, you know, I think what's really powerful is the deep, long-term temporal spatial commitment to a neighborhood. So anyway, it's super exciting. And the more I get into the work, and we can talk about the book project, but it just keeps kind of growing how to think about the work and inspiring. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's always kind of struck me too, right? The peel the potatoes is always in the back of my mind. Wash the dishes, and that is that I think of the residency program, and that being one of the key lessons, right? Is that you're not just down there for a semester to do sort of a service project. You're there to learn, right? You're there to peel the potatoes in some ways, and that is a sort of an epistemology, a way of kind of understanding historical power structures and your role as a student and these kinds of things. And I've always thought of it to these points of scholarship. And Michael, you mentioned kind of an undercommons and thinking of this kind of notion of sort of a kind of a fugitive planning or study, to use the words of Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, and always thinking of the center and that work within one particular neighborhood as a kind of type of fugitive planning and study. And then again, I think that's in many ways is very different from other kinds of engaged programs that may work across the city. They may work, on these fee-for-service kinds of projects, right? They're trying to figure out financial models, all these kinds of things. And so the commitment to one singular neighborhood, and Kenny, to your point of, sort of starting in the 80s, and it wasn't until 15 years later that the actual work began, that's this soil building in some ways. And so I think that all just resonates so true with, I think, what we're still seeing and in the work that's still going on down and over the Rhine and at the center. So really wonderful comments. I do obviously want to make sure we get to your discussion of the book, as you all have a book you're working on together. So maybe with that, I'll just open it up and allow you all to kind of talk about maybe how these conversations started, what's the kind of focus of the book, and any other details you want to share about it.
Yeah, I was kind of modestly employed in Sacramento in housing policy and started sitting in on a class by Michael at Davis. And then Mathias happened to be in town, and I happened to have interviewed Mathias 5 years earlier or 3 years earlier or so. And then, we kind of started a dialogue. I mean, you guys have had a longer relationship, but, we kind of started then after Tom died, uniting around like, wow, we need to be thinking with these ideas. And in a not completely sure what that meant, we just started reading some texts together and having a Zoom conversation. And one text at a time over about 6 months. And that kind of started the ball rolling toward us just like rethinking this work in our own professional lives and kind of the great loss for the architecture profession. And I'll say personally, I mean, I've made this point before, but or in a different way, but that the legacy I feel in the architecture world isn't as substantial as it should be. And I think that's something that's also, I think, maybe a common motivator for us.
I can say, I think we talk about the status of the book project maybe in a couple of minutes, but like the motivation, I think, at least from my perspective, also has one reason. One reason of the motivation I have is that I think there is always work, crucial work, which is not yet in the books, right? So it was basically similar 20 years ago when I was starting to engage to understand the history of participatory architecture, as we're calling it in Western Europe. with a friend of mine, and we understood that there was almost nothing in the books, like on the European or German book market. And we understood this is crucial, right? This is crucial for our to save our own souls, but also it's crucial for the field. And I think it's the same for other community designers in the States. There are a couple of ones who are kind of well known, but there is overall, I would say in general, not yet at all enough of, let's say, radical community design work in the books, right? We have a lot of public design publications, public interest design publications, but the more radical thinking and practices, they are not yet in the books. And so Tom and the center's work, I think, is only one of many, right? So there might be much more. So that's my, a rather general understanding. And then in terms of what we were discussing before, if you do that work, be it within a university or as I'm doing it right now within a city hall, if you do institutional work and if you want to contribute massively to radical change, to use those institutions and kind of make them work as least partially as an undercommons, right? We all know what kind of a difficult job that is, right? And we all know how stressful it is, how depressing it can be on the everyday level for a lot of various reasons. And so how do you re-energize yourself, right? And I think literature, so to say, theory, but also the arts, that's also common in terms of Samuel Mockbee's work, because I have a different look at that, because I think architecture, as we're also talking amongst architects here, at least in part, great design is also crucial to save our souls, right? Let's not forget that, right? If things are only functional, that's not enough, right? So there's also a need for poetics, right? I mean, but that's a sidestep. But don't let us forget the poetics in life. But of course, also let us not forget theory, radical theory, and that's rather where Tom was coming from, I would say. And so I think those two aspects, to wrap it up, it's a work which is not yet in the books, right? We have articles, but we don't have it in the books. There's not yet a book of his most seminal writings, and it should be there. And it could be us, it could be others who do it, but it's something we need to have, so to say, for all these reasons. Even so, we might not see the great push through or the major change happening in our lifetime, right? But that's my last comment on that. For me, it is crucial that I had been exposed to radical thinking and radical practices. I had been exposed to these are those really great texts, and I can get back to them in moments of crisis, in moments of overwork, in moments of depression. You know, they pop up, and so it's also part of survival, right? It's crucial to imagine another world, right? To have stuff like Tom's in the books. So I mean, so there's also certain strategy behind it, right? Like why I think I want to do it.
Maybe I can try to connect something that Mathias brought up, I think, in reference to Kenny earlier about design and the comparison of, Rural Studio and the work of the center. And I think it actually does center around this idea of aesthetics, right? And I think the part of the project for me in terms of inspiration is this idea that, we not aesthetics in a sort of formal sort of visual vocabulary, but in terms of what aesthetics serves and who it serves, and to relationships of power and how power is concealed through aesthetics, but a different type of aesthetics that in a sense opens up possibilities for imaginings of different worlds. And I think of the agitprop, projects, which I've written about the center's work there. I think this is about an aesthetics that, in a sense, reveals the type of work that the center and represents, Tom's writings represent, so that it does not remain in a place where it is cherished by the few, but fully appreciated by the many. And so I think this we need to think about aesthetics from a slightly different lens than just a purely visual, but in terms of what it reveals and conceals, or both, and under what circumstances, and the ability to really pull the layer back around that veil of ignorance, to quote, I believe, Henri Lefebvre.
Yeah, very good. I'm thinking of having conversations with Tom about, Lucien Kroll and this idea of kind of a democratic architecture, right? And there's a kind of, it's not just the look, it's the process itself that kind of becomes the thing that's important. The other thing that I've been kind of looking at lately for a project we're working on with the center and the People's Movement is just all these really wonderful kind of documentaries from the People's Movement over the Rhine, and just seeing how much of the neighborhood was built by hand, right? So people, taking buckets and just, literally hand by hand, day after day, to kind of produce the neighborhood, is really kind of astounding to think of as a certain kind of ethos, and making a way out of no way, but in a very kind of joyful way as well. So I think that's part of that kind of aesthetic question that I think is kind of very interesting. I don't know that we're on such a tight limit here, but are there other details about the book that you all want to share about title or anticipated release, or what's kind of the structure of the book, and what's the kind of the planning for that, and where it's at right now?
I mean, I can tell who approached us, right? So we were approached by a friend and colleague of mine, Jesko Fezer. He's part of a group of series editors. They're publishing the so-called, or they're editing the so-called Bauweltfundamente, which is a book series which is existing since the early 60s, basically publishing seminal texts on architecture planning, but also always related in terms of radical trends or radical thinking, I think. And they started to do also English publications since a couple of years with that new board of editors. And they approached us. It's part of the Birkhäuser publishing house, which some of you might know. And so we conceptualized something. We did a proposal and handed it in, and they kind of like it. That's the status quo. We don't have a yes yet, so we have not made a contract or something. But so far, it seems quite positive. Maybe Michael and Kenny about the proposal. I don't know.
I've got some more details here. I mean, so we were kind of So first of all, like we kind of laid out, the three of us have been in dialogue about Tom's writings, about the impact of the center and how to kind of bring that into kind of architecture history, make it more broadly accessible. I've also been in more dialogue with John Blake and Jeff and Janice Dutton as well about the kind of work, different initiatives, and so forth. And so we've received kind of support and encouragement from folks, in Ohio about the project. Right now, we're kind of playing with the idea of a title like Deep Engagement in grounding architectural practice and social movements, as a collection of writings of Tom's, and those being structured with an introduction where we're setting the context of the writings. And then a second section on critiques of urban inequality. A third, this is collections of writings of Tom's with colleagues in some cases. The third section, social movements for justice. The fourth section, critiques of architectural practice. The fifth, critical pedagogies and architectural education. And the sixth, potentially some additional materials like an interview with Tom or so forth. So,
fantastic, great. So much to look forward to. Yeah, those sections sound wonderful. Is there anything else you feel we should discuss, or things sort of lingering from other parts of the conversation?
I just would like to add that that of course, me personally, I mean, it would be fantastic if we would have the possibility once to visit you all over there.
Yeah.
And then also if the book project really is going to become what we hope for, that we would have the possibility to also have a critical dialogue. Like we don't right now. I mean, we were asked to hand in kind of a a minimum kind of version of what we can think of. So I'm just mentioning that right now we're thinking of only republishing a couple of seminal texts of Tom organized in those spheres, like Kenny was kind of mentioning. But of course, ideally, we have thought about a much larger version, so to say. Ideally, we were having ideas that we would also like to invite others kind of to ping pong certain texts, right? Like people who are much younger, who are now active not only in Over the Rhine, but also in other places in the States, but also in other places in the world. What would happen then, if you would kind of curate kind of a dialogue between these or those texts of Tom and invite others to kind of not comment only, but also to react. But that's just sharing that there are other ideas. There's also the ideas to come to Over the Rhine and to have a workshop, a symposium, a conference, whatever. But if we will make the book, that's already a lot. But maybe it gets much more, and it would be beautiful.
If I can, given that we're sort of closing up and just thinking about this conversation and for some of the motivations for this book project. So I'm thinking about Ivory Perry, who was a longtime St. Louis community activist whose works were chronicled by George Lipsitz, a colleague of ours. And so Ivory Perry responded to a reporter that was interviewing Perry and said something like, Ivory, you were way ahead of your time in the struggle for civil rights. And he responded pretty quickly with, ahead of my time, I'm just in time. Why is everyone so late? And I think this captures who Tom was, his patience to wait for others to understand the depth of his thinking, his practice, and also just his dogged persistence about what really matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody's going to follow that up.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jeff. This was really fun. And anybody wants to be in touch, we're happy to be.
Yeah, I love this idea of having some dialogue and finding a way to get you all here. But yeah, I think Michael's comment can't be topped there. So thank you all so much to the panel, to Mathias, to Kenny, and to Michael. Really enjoyed the conversation. We hope to continue it, and we look forward to somehow continuing the dialogue. So awesome! Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a great celebration.
Yeah.
Thank you. We will.
Wish we could be there.
Yeah.
Greetings from Berlin.